My name is Derek. I'm a student in the bachelor's program at Landmark.
Woo woo!
There's the idea of the zombie, which has its ties and origin intertwined with culture. The nature of the zombie can be seen as an impure being and a distorted animated creature with an insatiable appetite. The genre of horror has explored a great deal with the human psyche. The Walking Dead explores a dwindling civilization grasping at what is left. Robinson Jeffers, a poet, in an introduction to his poetry, describes what conjures motivation to his own creativity. I was doomed to go on imitating dead men unless some impossible wind should blow me emotions or ideas or a point of view, or even mere rhythms that had not occurred to them. There was nothing to do about it. This evokes the idea of the zombie as a desirous possession by nature. There is a more naturalistic version of the zombie. This is just merely another cultural representation of the zombie. Dr. Jenn McCollum's talk will elaborate in greater detail of how rich the concept is. She has written a variety of essays in gender studies, and her focal point is the Victorian period. I would go check out her 2 essays entitled Animation and Reanimation in the Victorian Gothic and Jane Eyre and Zombies. She also has a forthcoming book entitled The Victorian Zombie. Please welcome my professor, friend, and fellow literary lover, Jenn.
Thank you. Thanks, Derek. I wanted to thank Derek for the introduction. Introductions can be, they can be pretty hard sometimes, and I think you did a great job, Derek. I also wanted to thank Jeff Burgess for asking me and inviting me to present in the speaker series, really giving me the opportunity to talk in public about zombies, which is something that if you're a zombie lover and you're passionate about zombies, you really welcome the chance to do that. How often do you get to do that? It's just super cool. Welcome to the talk. Tonight's talk is entitled Sexing the Zombie, the Changing Body of a Timeless Global Fixation. And Halloween is almost upon us. Woo woo, Halloween. My daughter's actually dressing up as a shark, a landmark shark, if you will. I'll be posting pictures on my Twitter and my Facebook. You want to see that? She's 3 years old, so it's going to be cute. So with Halloween comes, I think, during Halloween, the time of Halloween, our fascination with the conflation between life and death really comes to the forefront. My talk looks back through history at how the life-death fascination has manifested in the trope of reanimated corpses. And moreover, what these Walking Dead can tell us about gender politics in a general sense. In fact, it may be surprising that The Walking Dead has anything at all to articulate about anything at all, right? But my study is going to take us back through history to kind of look at how the reanimated corpse has taken shape through our culture. During tonight's talk, I will take us through a very abridged history. It's taken me a long time to narrow this down, guys, like a really long time, because there's so much out there in terms of mythologies, with resurrection and reanimation. There's just so much there that I really had to kind of narrow my focus. And I'm focusing on about 5 primary tropes here that I think are really important in telling us something about gender. So that's what you can expect from me this evening. I'm going to lead you on this journey through using images that are not necessarily chronological, although their motifs will be chronological. So you'll see a lot of fine art up here that might not necessarily bring to mind the zombie as we know it in the 21st century, but we'll see it through time and its different changes and incarnations. My name is Jenn. I am a professor here at Landmark College in the English department, and I see a lot of familiar faces here tonight, so I'm really glad that you guys could make it. My primary work deals with the Victorian period. I teach classes in writing and literatures, and I'm really interested in gender studies particularly masculinity studies. And as Derek said, I do have a book coming out called The Victorian Zombie, which will focus kind of on the last leg of what you're going to see today. My book will really be getting into how we see the zombie playing out during the Victorian era. So if you're interested, that will be coming out shortly, I hope. The zombie that has transfixed our Western gaze in recent years is not as novel as pupils of the compelling trope may at first surmise. Certainly the zombie today is distinctive, as it hybridizes past representations while offering unique addendums that capitalize on 21st century fears and desires. Reanimated corpses in the arts, in the fine arts, have shouldered messages that are unique to their historical and cultural moments. Like most tropes, today's zombie displays the ailments, anxieties, and even to a certain degree the hopes of its circumstances. Today, zombies have invaded the discourses of individuality, consciousness, even business, even international politics, interestingly, higher education, and the law. You can see in the slide here, this is a title from a recent book, Zombies in the Academy, Living Death in Higher Education. Some excellent scholars have published in this. So the idea of the zombie trope is really invading so many disciplines right now in the 21st century. Daniel Dresner, for example, in his book Theories of International Politics and Zombies, earnestly connects the zombie motif with international relations when he observes that, quote, in many ways, international relations is the missing link in most discussions of how to cope with a zombie uprising. Who knew? Right? It's crazy. He goes on to state that, quote, narratives about the living dead use small communities or families as their unit of social analysis. The effect of national governments or international relations is barely discussed, unquote, in this context. But for him, zombies are pivotal to contemporary discourses about international politics. Robert Blanton reinforces this parallel when he urges that higher education institutions should embrace zombie invasion scenarios because doing so, quote, brings to bear many of the key issues and controversies of international relations theory. Also stressing the connection between zombies and occupational facets of modern life, Stephen Hacker notes that, quote, the perils of zombieism have infiltrated all levels of the labor ranks with their infected brains. Perhaps best articulating the important role of the zombie in today's society is the New York Times article in which Heather Havrilsky fashions Bill Gates to a zombie who is, quote, awkward and clumsy, yet unself-conscious about the fact that his eyeball is falling out. Havrilsky believes that people like Gates appear to be the collaborators, the leaders, the fanatics, the obsessives of society, and are much more likely to join a group or rally a big crowd around a cause like a zombie would. In this contemporary context, zombies embrace narratives that concern huge movements, sea changes, trends, critical events, paradigm shifts. They volunteer, form support groups, and fixate on the next big thing. They are ultimately more dangerous than other cultural monsters, such as vampires. And Havrilsky fashions the vampire to Steve Jobs and Obama, just to give you an example. Really interesting discourse is happening. Zombies have invaded not only the discourses surrounding contexts such as individuality, business, international politics, but they've also nestled deep within the marrow of higher education. Academics from many disciplines increasingly confront the potential of a pedagogy informed by zombic gestures, aesthetics, and themes. Theorists such as Dresner are apparently working from the academic trend that I traced to 2008-2009 due to the MLA. The MLA, the Modern Language Association, had this panel in 2008, 2009 that really focused on zombies and academics. And I think that a lot of the works that have come out recently are kind of piggybacking on that trend. One of the things to keep in mind here at the start of the presentation is that it's important to think that the zombie motif is not a 21st century or even a 20th century creation, that it indeed goes back through our human history quite a ways. So the first question that comes to mind is, what is a zombie anyway? And this is actually, I find, to be a pretty tough question to answer. It's pretty complex. Defining a zombie is actually tough work. And it's been tough work for me to really land on a definitive sense of what the zombie is. There are several more potential definitions than the ones that I'm going to offer you in the next slide. But the definitions that I've chosen are kind of three-pronged. I'm going to offer you three different ways of understanding the zombie that I think are most useful when you think about gender. So the first definition, I think, is maybe the most important definition, or the most familiar definition of the zombie, comes to us from David Chalmers, who wrote a book called The Conscious Mind, and that's where I picked up these quotes from. His work is kind of a foundational work when it comes to zombie politics. And Chalmers uses this idea of consciousness to define what a zombie is. And I tend to agree with him to an extent. The first quote here, Chalmers outlines that a zombie is someone or something identical to me, but lacking conscious experience altogether. He calls a zombie a twin who judges he is unconscious with convictions that are utterly and systemically false. And he also finds that zombie consciousness is underdeveloped because, quote, I have experiences and he, the twin, doesn't. So something really interesting comes through with this definition, that Chalmers really sees the zombie as almost a kind of doppelganger, right? A double of the self. That's super interesting to me. And he sees that, the self, we have an open consciousness, we have an awareness of who we are, whereas this double, this kind of mirror image of us, right, doesn't have that. So it has very limited or really no consciousness at all. It's kind of driven by something else. That leads us to the next definition, which comes from Masahiro Mori's The Uncanny Valley. Many of you may be familiar with his theories of robotics. But in The Uncanny Valley, Mori outlines what the human is versus the other. And he kind of has this sense of, something that is closest to being human versus farthest away from being human. And zombies are kind of the furthest point on his chart from the human. But they still are the uncanny. And what's uncanny is kind of something that is a lot like us, but there's oftentimes a sharp difference that distinguishes this other being from us, right? That makes it uncanny, so kind of uncomfortable. Like it kind of looks like me, kind of acts like me, but there's something about it that makes it really clearly not me. So Mori positions the zombie as the most uncanny, the most unsettling of all of the things that he notes in that uncanny valley. And in this way, the zombie is a representation of our fears, right? Of our kind of, maybe even our repressed desires. And the final definition, which is, for me, the most interesting, perhaps the most relevant when it comes to gender, and certainly race, which is something that I talk about in my book, but won't be talking about in this slideshow today, because we're limited. I'm trying to stay focused. Is the idea that the zombie is a subaltern post-colonial being. And a lot of critics have written about this. Here are some quotes from just a few. The first comes from Kyle Bishop. Kyle Bishop, I like his work. He works on the modern American zombie prototype. He writes that zombies represent the lowest level of the economic system. They are the ultimate slaves or in industrial terms, the downtrodden, unrepresented proletariat labor force. You think about zombies that way, right? He thinks that the zombies are a representation of what Marx calls the lumpen proletariat, because they have no will or mind of their own. The zombies are not only unrepresented, but also unrepresentable. So that's a firm quote from Kyle Bishop that I think really articulates that idea that the zombie is the ultimate other. According to him as well, they have no will or mind of their own, and so they can never achieve the realization in self-consciousness. Johanna Fandrich, who works a lot with the idea of the voodoo zombie prototype, which I will not be bringing in to today's discussion, although it's certainly there, and we could talk about it later, maybe during a Q&A session. But she says that voodoo is one of the oldest religions on the planet, which emerged under the trauma of slavery as an assertion of resistance. It is a religion from below. As a result, the zombie is silent, enslaved, and unable to connect with the dominant culture through any liminal space or discourse. And finally, just piggybacking on that and sealing the deal, Wade Davis, in one of his books on the zombie, says that the zombie is a phenomenon that is at the heart of the peasant's being. So super Marxist, right? Super class-related, really invoking kind of Spivak's idea of the subaltern, if you're familiar with that. I know some of you are. So really kind of bringing that to light, that that's how a lot of critics are viewing the zombie today. Okay. An interest in the resurrection, this is the only image, by the way, that you'll get that looks like the 21st century zombie, so soak it in. From here on out, it's going to be a little bit weird. This is an image actually from The Walking Dead. And I wanted to talk during this slide about just a glimpse of what revenants are. Revenant is really anything that is dead and then is brought back to life. And there are many different kinds of revenants that we read about in religion, in mythologies, in literature. Any god, any angel, that's often a revenant. Any kind of demon, ghosts, vampires, mummies, and of course, zombies. When I first started doing research on the zombie, I could not find anything predating the 20th century in terms of academic work. For some reason, the zombie is thought of as a modern phenomenon, but the more that I reached back through research, I increasingly saw a trail of zombies through history. Few scholars pay attention to how the zombie modalities or zombie bodies have been presented before even Romero's 1968 film, Night of the Living Dead. Or, maybe some really ambitious critics would go back to H.P. Lovecraft's 1921 short story, Reanimator. Any Lovecraft fans? Yes, I saw it, yeah, okay. I wasn't really interested in looking at the zombie from the modern perspective. Rather, I wanted to trace it as far back as I possibly could in order to understand how it manifested in the Victorian era. An interest in the resurrection of the dead can be traced at least as far back as Mesopotamia. I want to note, firstly, though, that for Mesopotamians, physical death was not the ultimate end of life. In fact, they seemed to believe that the dead continued in animated existence as etemu, which was closely associated with the corpse. So, for example, it was identical to the living body. The etemu, the body after death, for Mesopotamians was identical to the body that you see before you in life. Death was sometimes referred to as sleeping in the grave. And the important factor here is that the etemu retained its human living needs and desires, such as thirst, and more importantly, hunger. So I think in the early Mesopotamian prototype of the reanimated dead, we really see that kind of hungry, voracious, driven by basal desire zombie that we see in the 21st century. It required sustenance. In one early tale, this is because the food of the netherworld is, quote, bitter, and the water is brackish. As long as the etemu was able to get sustenance, it was at peace. Also noteworthy is that the Etemu kept its social class, and its health depended on how its physical body and gravesite were cared for after death. Here I want to mention only one story. So in the slides that come out, I'm only going to focus on one story of the Mesopotamian Babylonian mythology, and that's going to be the descent of Ishtar, or Inanna, to the underworld. Is anybody familiar with that mythology? Okay. Anybody who's in, okay, cool. So a couple of you. Okay. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to focus on how this Mesopotamian story really invokes a sense of female power. This goddess, Inanna, Ishtar, depending on which mythology you're reading, passes through 7 gates on her journey to the netherworld, and at each gate she is stripped of her garments until she enters the city of the dead completely naked. I tend to read this stripping of Ishtar's body as a signal that her power becomes stronger as she is more bodied. Okay. Her body in turn becomes more apparent, more visible. It carries more currency. Some of the oldest Mesopotamian texts relate that a goddess was queen of the netherworld during Ishtar's descent. In later tales, she's replaced by a male god, but in earlier tales, it's a female god who rules the underworld. So in these foundational tales, female power appears to be associated with the descent. Ishtar is known as the goddess of sexual love and also of war, but for Mesopotamians, that wasn't necessarily, those were not in conflict with each other. That was, war and love, they were pretty equal. Right? There wasn't any tension there. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ishtar's threat to bully the living by resurrecting revenants presents what is most likely the first instance of zombification in literature, in my finding. As she invokes the undead to strategically avenge herself against Gilgamesh, who rejects her sexual advances. Her hypothetical army of the dead would consume the living, acting out the fury which Ishtar cannot herself externalize. In this early tale, Ishtar claims the power to reanimate the dead in order to accomplish the violent deeds that she is not capable of enacting herself. Namely, she wants to kill Gilgamesh because he rejects her. Such power seems to be explicitly feminine in the Epic of Gilgamesh, as no male figure seems to be able to invoke the dead in this early epic. But her power is a little bit limited. For example, when first rejected by Gilgamesh, Ishtar immediately asks her father Anu for help. She says, "Father, please give me the bull of heaven, so in his dwelling I may slay Gilgamesh." The bull of heaven is her first wish for revenge, yet she is not at liberty to invoke it. She has to ask permission from her dad. But after he says, "Well, I don't know if I'm going to give you that," she kind of takes it up a notch and threatens to bring the dead back to the earth. She says, "If you do not give me the bull of heaven, I shall smash the gates of the netherworld right down to its dwelling. To the world below I shall grant manumission. I shall bring up the dead to consume the living. I shall make the dead outnumber the living." Ishtar's dominion is clearly below ground, and she is at the mercy of men for retribution upon men. Marshalling the undead appears simultaneously feminine and apparently much more potent punishment. So she says basically, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to bring the dead up onto the world, and then you're going to be in trouble. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for me, aligns femininity with the strength of the undead. And this power appears pretty terrifying. And there's the quote that I read to you from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Here's the Burney relief, which is an amalgamation of symbols and images that depict both Ishtar, represented in this image through the rod and ring, The crown, the lions, the owl, the beads and bracelet, all of those symbolize that this is a figure of Ishtar, but also Lilith. If you're familiar with Lilith through mythology, Lilith's symbols are the draped wings, her frontal nakedness, the owl feet, and the horned crown. So she kind of has a mixed crown there. The figure is that of Lilith, but some of the symbols are definitely associated with Ishtar or Inanna. The overall message here that I want you to take away is one of sexual activity, fertility, and dominion over nature, with all its inherent oppositions: birth versus death, peace versus violence, animal versus human. And I think that all of these dichotomies play a central role in the zombie motif through history. Okay. In the New Testament, the authority of reanimating corpses is synonymous, conversely, with masculine potency, in my opinion. The resurrection of Lazarus by Christ and of Christ by God highlights a founding principle of Christianity. It's the process of being born again. A reanimated corpse is the vessel of central Christian doctrine, whose purpose is to articulate the universal human condition. And its power is, according to my reading, completely masculine. The biblical zombie reflects social consciousness through male initiation and male sacrifice. So the first image here, I have two to show you of Christ's resurrection. This scene was the last in a series of 5 panels illustrating episodes from the Passion of Christ. The depiction of Christ's tomb as a cave appears repeatedly in Italian art of the 14th and early 15th centuries. Here, a glimpse into the cave reveals Christ's marble sarcophagus. The resurrected Christ emits rays of light. He emerges triumphantly from the darkness. His resurrection is presented as a kind of enlightenment. I mean, this is a pretty hopeful image for many people who would be looking at it. It is interpreted as a very positive image, a very positive action for many. In this panel from the altar of Saint Zeno of Verona, a radiant Christ steps out of his grave, surrounded by angels. You can see little angel faces kind of decorating his light halo there. Bunch of little, so it's kind of like revenants celebrating revenants. It's like meta revenant there. Which is cool. In his left hand, he holds the flag of the Crusaders. The tomb is situated again in a cave. The soldiers who keep guard seem startled or in awe, but I don't think that they seem, horrified or really afraid. This is again a triumphant representation of resurrection and rebirth. According to John, Christ hears that his friend Lazarus is close to death due to illness, but instead of rushing to the sick bed, Christ hesitates, claiming that God's Son will be glorified. After 4 days, he finally arrives and has Lazarus' tomb unsealed. Christ then calls Lazarus' name, and he rises from the dead. As Katie Thomas argues, Lazarus' resurrection illuminates the process of enslavement, as he ceases to be an individual after he comes back to life. After this episode, he no longer has a name, for example. He's never named after that point. Thomas goes on to assert that secular and Christian zombification have one very important difference. For him, secular practices express the belief that death itself is the astringent for the impurities garnered in life, while Christian doctrine tries to offset death via Christ's miracle. Rather than becoming a nullity due to his zombification, Lazarus is a representation of all man's guilt and impurity. I hope that you reflect here too, back to my earlier slide where Kyle Bishop and others relate the zombie to a post-colonial other being, because I think that Thomas does that as well in his discussion of Lazarus. Lazarus looks more like a mummy here, though, don't you think? Do you see him emerging over there? Yeah. Right. I want to note here too that during the Victorian era, Robert Browning penned a long poem, and the title of this poem is the longest title of any poem in the world. Are you ready for it? The title of the poem is An Epistle Containing the Strange Medical Experiences of Karshish, an Arab Physician. That's the name of the poem. It's a great poem. It's very long. I'll call it Karshish for short. And in this poem, Browning describes Lazarus's resurrection as both a sickness and a cure for sickness simultaneously. In this poem, resurrection has made Lazarus, and these are quotes, has made Lazarus a stark, mad, and witless man with an impoverished brain, who eyes the world now like a child in a stupor. His large eyes further evidence a zombic man who is compelled to act out the desires of another. So again, we see this zombic figure without self-consciousness, without power over his own body. He evidences sure signs of zombification. I'm just going to read to you this passage from Karshish here. Browning writes of Lazarus, "His heart and brain move there, his feet stay here. So is the man perplexed with impulses, sudden to start off crosswise, not straight on, proclaiming what is right and wrong across, and not along. This black thread through the blaze, it should be, balked by here it cannot be. And oft the man's soul springs into his face, as if he saw again and heard again his sage that bade him rise, and he did rise. Something, a word, a tick of the blood within, admonishes. Then back he sinks at once to ashes, who was very fire before." In this passage, Lazarus has limited consciousness of his actions and desires as he falls under the control of someone else, ostensibly Christ or God. Lazarus is strong, but he's also weak, similarly to how Thomas describes him in the New Testament. Browning's critique of reanimation shows that while a high degree of power was still attributed to the masculine zombic body later in the Victorian era, it also appears grotesque, even sickly. Yet this too is a kind of masculine power. Coming up next in our trajectory is a quick investigation of Greek culture and mythology. And I'm being super, super picky here because there's so much resurrection and reanimation in Greek and Roman mythology. You think about Achilles, Memnon, you think about Adonis, the stories go on and on. I'm going to focus here just on one Greek story, and it's from Phlegon's Book of Marvels. And the Book of Marvels, Phlegon actually, he narrates stories that are true, and for him, bizarre. So these are not works of fiction if you've read Phlegon's Book of Marvels. He's supposed to be relating things that actually happened. I'm going to tell you a story today of Fellinian in the Greek tradition, narrated by Phlegon in his Book of Marvels. Oh no! All right, brought it back to life. Speaking of it's resurrected. It's a revenant now. It's perfect. So when Fellinian reanimates herself in Phlegon's tale, she realigns zombification with the kind of feminine power that we saw earlier with Ishtar, but with a very important difference. Phlegon documents the apparently true tale of Fellinian, a woman who rises from her grave in order to romance Machates, who is not her husband, by the way, but rather who is a guest staying in her parents' home. So following her death, she, after 6 months of being married to another man, she rises again and kind of enters this man's bedroom and comes to him at night, and they have relations. Unlike Ishtar, who seeks power from the dead rather than from herself, Fellinian is the undead vessel of her own desires. So that's really important. Fellinian resurrects herself kind of comes on the scene and then does what she wants with machetes. As one of the undead, she is physically empowered to achieve her great sexual desire for machetes completely, no questions asked. Machetes does not at first believe that his late-night lover is dead because she's so animated, she's so lively. And by the way, she's been dead ostensibly for 6 months when she comes to machetes. But when she emerges, she's still hot, right? So, you know, it's dark, but it's not that dark, right? So she's looking really good. So this is a quote. This is a quote from Phlegon. Machetes wished to investigate the whole incredible matter to find out if the girl he was consorting with, who took care to come to him at the same hour, was actually dead. She ate and drank with him. He simply could not believe what others had told him. So word's going around like, dude, like your girl is dead, you know, man. Like you need to turn on some lights and check that out. And he's like, I don't know, you know, she seems really lively. So he's not sure. However, when he brings it up to her parents are like, yeah, she died like 6 months ago. So as a form of, and they kind of call her out, right? So they're like, you know, yeah, if you're consorting with our daughter, you need to know that she's dead, and that's not cool. Like she's married, so that's, you know, that's not looking good for our family. You need to step back. And so he's, you know, so she gets really mad, and she says, "How dare you step in and ruin this good thing that I've got going with machetes?" So she says to them, "Mother and father, how unfairly you have grudged my being with the guest for 3 days in my father's house, since I have caused no one any pain. For this reason, on account of your meddling, you shall grieve for me all over again, and I shall return to the place appointed for me." So then she goes back to her grave, lays down in it, and she's dead forevermore, as a punishment to her parents. So now you have to grieve for me all over again because you took machetes away. As a zombie, Fellinian possesses the power to satisfy her erotic appetite, which is no small thing for a woman, right? As well as to punish her parents for denying it to her. So I just want to quickly summarize, what do these zombies, these 3 zombies, tell us about gender before we move forward? A comparison between the 3 early zombie figures of Ishtar, Lazarus, and Fellinian highlights a relationship between zombification, gender difference, and power through mobility of the dead. The Epic of Gilgamesh presents a female as the sovereign of resurrected bodies. Ishtar can summon zombies and use them to her purpose. Her power is ultimate and very feminine in nature. In the New Testament, resurrection goes on to become a founding doctrine of Christianity, as Lazarus is reanimated in order to fulfill a larger social role, to evidence Christ's miraculous powers. And to articulate the creed of Christian rebirth. Christ usurps the power of resurrection, once attributed to Ishtar, since the power of Christian zombification is entirely male, according to my reading. I really couldn't find a whole lot of female power in the biblical idea of resurrection and rebirth, although maybe someone could. I don't think Dan Miller's here, so I could call him. Dan. Women are absent from the role in which they may have once dominated, and this suggests that gender difference is an important factor in these tales of resurrection. Fellinian's resurrection presents a female with privileges reserved only for Christian males. And it's interesting that Phlegon's Book of Marvels was circulated the same time as the New Testament, so they're contemporaneous works, almost rivalry works in some ways, I think. Because she doesn't function as a symbol for humankind in the same way that Lazarus does, Fellinian is a dangerous vessel. Right? She is the walking embodiment of her own socially unacceptable desires. At the very least, the function of zombification in these 3 tales suggests that gender roles and difference are a matter of importance, even rivalry, to the representation of the corpse in motion, which is where we're going to go next, the dancing corpse. I can't wait, right? So in the coming slides, I want to hone in on how the animated corpse, namely the dancing corpse, comes in to complicate matters even more. Who doesn't love dancing zombies? Super cool. The dance of death has been a popular theme since its appearance in the 15th century. For me, this theme is integral because it expresses the strong desire to move forward, to be active, to come alive in the face of deathly challenges. Reanimated corpses is a theme that signals the fear of a capacity for change. Victorians ate this up during the Victorian era because it was a time, for those of you in my Monsters and Men class in the Victorian era, we're really focused on how Victorians really feared, the change of the Industrial Revolution and what came, and why they were so preoccupied with the zombie. But this all relates back to the Dance of Death theme. I read the Dance of Death motif as a response to the actual incidents of dancing mania in Europe during this time, which were consistently relayed through female corporeal experience, in which a woman's public dancing body was the symbol of the primary illness as a whole, usually hysteria. Choreomania, as it was called, was frequently associated with women, despite the fact that many men actually suffered from this disease of uncontrollable dancing. People would be unable to stop dancing. Some would die, actually. Some of them would die right in the streets, right? People thought that they were being possessed. There was a lot of speculation. This dancing rage was viewed as a feminine and feminizing malady. It was an expression of the dangers of the unmediated body. The engraving that you see here is actually an adaptation of an earlier work by Peter Bruegel. And there have been actually several adaptations of this work because it's been really popular through time. In it, some men come to restrain women who have been seen in the thralls of dancing mania, a deathly physical encounter, and powerful, so powerful. Because when you see people in the streets having uncontrolled gesticulations of their body, they're sweating, they seem like they're possessed, that's dangerous because it incites, mass hysteria. People are like, what are you doing? People start freaking out. So it's a very powerful thing. Many doctors during the period related this notorious disease to women. Most significant in these observations is the issue of gender. For historians, artists, doctors, all of them, they constantly want to relate this to females. The Danse Macabre, do you know this one? This is a famous one, yeah. The Danse Macabre imparts that in death, all status is abolished. Kind of the opposite of what we see in the Mesopotamian representations. In death, we are all equal. We are all one. This is very different from the Mesopotamian idea of death. In this much earlier engraving by Michael Walgamet, we see that the figures of dancing death, they lack gender markings at all. They're just bones. That we saw, it's very different than what we saw in the previous engraving, where the dancing bodies are very fleshy and very human. Notke's famous mural of the Dance of Death portrays dancers as skeletons without obvious gender or sex markings, much like Walgamet's. In this work, ambiguously gendered skeletons join hands with royalty and other political figures, making the argument that death affects everyone equally despite his or her position. The figure of death here is gender neutral, while its victims are clearly gendered as male or female. Notke's mural is sandwiched between two earlier representations. One is the Dance of Death de Homme, and the other is the Dance of Death de Femme. Each of these depict just men or just women, and Notke's kind of comes in the middle of both of those. While choreomania is still presented an active threat for society in the 15th century, many artists like Notka and Walgamet did not affiliate the skeleton dancers with any particular gender at all, even though a large number of nonfiction and medical writings tended to gender dancers as female. In general, it's interesting to note that visual depictions of dancing death remained mostly non-gendered until after the actual threat of choreomania passed. So it wasn't until the dancing rage moved on that we start to see the feminine and the male expressions come back to the death figure. Shortly after Hondius places fleshy women dancers in the dance of death, the gendered body of death significantly alters. The social imagination suddenly seemed less willing to entertain the spectacle of deathly women in art, despite its dwelling on the macabre female body in actual public acts and publications. Instead of focusing on the lively skeletons dancing or hovering around public figures, depictions of death increasingly became more solitary and visible. As conceptions of the dance of death moved away from the public spectacle of dancing, they also became more clearly gendered as male. Male death was implicated in much more isolated, personal, and aggressive actions. He tended to act independently and increasingly violently as time progressed. The death and the maiden theme is only one articulation of this movement from the 16th century. Let's take a look at this guy. Right? Pretty different from what we've seen so far. Where female versions of dancing death lost their effulgence, male death enters the playing field as a tour de force. The female figure of death nearly disappears from fine art portrayals between the late 16th century and the late 18th century, signaling that gender was an important factor in the presentations of macabre bodies. The engraving here, called Young Woman Attacked by Death, right, portrays an animated figure of death that is not only solitary and perceptible to his victim, but is defined by his display of maleness. And that's a manly zombie right there, right? Durer's figure is fully bodied, looking much more like the kind of zombie with which we are familiar in the 21st century. Different from Bruegel's and Hondius's portrayals of death as a dancing woman or skeleton who is vulnerable to attack, Durer's death is an assaulter. His figure of death is meaty, bearded, muscular, and violent as he rips into a young woman's skirt, pulling her away from the tree to which she latches for protection. Death is an aggressive male who presents a simultaneous sexual and mortal threat to women. Instead of lurking invisibly with other figures of death among numerous living bodies, he stalks an individual female victim, alone, like a predator stalking prey. Gender becomes a primary factor in the dance of death, as many artists follow Durer's representation, which became very popular in Europe as the death and the maiden theme. The following images are just a couple of note. Take a look at these. Like, encountering death almost looks like a rape scene, right? I mean, it's very invasive, and she's even crying, and he's kind of got his hand tucked under her breast as he's trying to eat her face, right? So, I mean, it's not funny, but he's trying to give her the kiss of death. Sure, here he's pulling on her hair, kind of lead her away to death, as she seems to be begging. Mm-hmm. Here death comes to the work scene, right, to the labor scene, and interrupts work.
Death is not noticeably male.
True, although his pelvis is tilting out. This last slide here helps me to introduce the next phase, leading to the Romantic era, in which death becomes somewhat desirable, and a penchant for melancholia comes to mark the ideal man. In this image here, we still see a woman being accosted by a masculine figure of death, but she doesn't seem so upset about it. In fact, she seems to have a certain degree of desire for it, right? She's kind of half bare-breasted, and he's dipping her back, and she's looking forward, like I don't want this, but I kind of do. Something kind of nice about it at the same time. Okay, during the Romantic era, which brings up the near close to this investigation, we see a real shift happen in how the public identifies with the figure of death. Take Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as an example. You know, students in my class are reading Frankenstein. Shout out, Frankenstein. Little wake up, Frankenstein, if anyone's read that. In Frankenstein, death appears to be a key to understanding life. It even seems scientific. Creating life from death, as Victor Frankenstein does, draws attention to the romantic fascination with the conflation of life and death. The boundaries seem deliciously blurry in Frankenstein. In Frankenstein, the line is restricted to males alone, however, as Victor Frankenstein refuses to create a bride for his creature. Despite the movie Bride of Frankenstein, right? That doesn't happen in Shelley's work. But not all writers of the Romantic era were as reluctant as Shelley to bring women into the picture. In the following few slides, I'm going to focus on Goethe as an example of one famous figure who reinvented the figure of the zombie as female. Goethe notoriously married the themes of dance and death together in some of his most popular works, such as Faust and The Sorrows of Young Werther. He also has a penchant toward reanimation in much of his poetry, such as this conveniently short poem. This is the poem in its entirety. I'm going to read it to you. It's called Apparent Death. Weep, maiden, weep here o'er the tomb of love. He died of nothing, by mere chance was slain. But is he really dead? Oh, that I cannot prove. A nothing, a mere chance, oft gives him life again. Any Goethe fans out there? Besides Derek?
Yeah.
Okay. But when Goethe reworked Fixation, which he did, anybody familiar with The Bride of Corinth? It's often thought to be the first vampire tale, although I disagree. But Goethe reworked Flegen's tale about Fixation at the end of the 18th century, and he signaled a coming together of older incarnations with contemporary doctrines in which fear concerning gender was highlighted through the trope of reanimation. In The Bride of Corinth, which has been called one of the earliest vampire tales in Western literature, Goethe invents the idea that Fixation and Machates are engaged to be married. How romantic. Appropriating Fixation's rogue desire to a certain degree. For example, rather than initiating an extramarital affair, as she does in Flegen's version, Goethe's Fixation-like protagonist appears to her lover in veil and garment, white arrayed. By consigning their romance to the marriage script, Goethe reflects a key transition in the literary imagining of gender power. While a female continues to harbor the force necessary for reanimation and the ability to materialize her erotic desires, she is able to do so only within the boundaries of marital discourse. In Bride of Corinth, the Fixation character, she's looked at with horror, not desire, like she is in Flegon's tale. Right? So when Fixation in Flegon's tale goes back to the tomb, it's just kind of like, parents, how dare you take away Machates? I'm just going to go back to my tomb and now you can suffer. In Goethe's adaptation, the Fixation character, the Bride of Corinth, she is just completely outcast. I mean, she's looked at as absolutely terrible. And she kind of goes back with kind of like blood dripping from her mouth, and she's very grotesque. There's not much to desire about her, for sure. The Bride of Corinth anticipates shifting paradigms concerning gender in the 19th century, and while Goethe took up the theme of reanimation predominantly in poems, He also used the novel form to explore its influence on gender and racial difference. We don't have time today, but if anyone's interested, Goethe's book, Elective Affinities, is a great book to look at in terms of reanimation and also doppelgangers. He kind of marries the two together there, if you're a fan of the doppelganger trope. That's not for this presentation, though. I want to end today's talk by just bringing out a couple themes from the Victorian zombie. The Victorian era is my real passion, and I just want to talk about a few ways that the Victorians adapted and took from this history of the zombie. The Victorian era saw what is called the cult of the woman as corpse, right? The cult of the woman as corpse was prolific, was everywhere in Victorian literature. This painting shows how the Gothic female body was medicalized. The dead female body was used as a source of knowledge about life. And I should mention, too, that the female corpse was often articulated as a source of extreme beauty and sexuality. And I'm not kidding you. Particularly the drowned female body. If you've ever seen, here's an example, the pre-Raphaelite fascination with Ophelia coming back. The Victorians had this super fascination with sexualizing this figure of the post-mortem rigor mortis body of a drowned woman who's committed suicide through drowning. You find it everywhere. I actually did my master's thesis on this motif. You can find it online if you'd like to read it. But there's so much there. So there's this idea that there's something very feminine and sexy and beautiful, aesthetically pleasing about the female corpse. Hot, right? No, right? You want to take her out after the... Okay. Just kidding. What did you say?
Only if she was on the Titanic.
Only if she was on the Titanic, right? Strange. It's a very interesting thing. Victorians also wanted to see deathly aspects in the everyday ongoings of their life. I think one of the reasons for this is because with so much change happening during this period, especially with the Industrial Revolution and people moving from the country into the city and their lives really changing, they were confronted head-on with death in a way that they never had been before. I mean, it was really like in their face. And they had to make sense of that changing world. And I think that they just invited wholesale this conflation of life and death into their lives. That Victorians were really desperate to see the humanity of dying, right? Of death and the fear of death and all the things that come with it. Victorians thought of death as always in the background. In Jane Eyre, for example, zombification, I think, is central to the idea of what it means to be an ideal citizen. I did write an article called Jane Eyre and Zombies that talks about how Rochester and Jane Eyre are actually zombified by Bronte and how this zombification leads them to seem more human. And here's Van Gogh's, representation of a smoking skeleton. How human is that? It's death being human in a way. Victorians wanted to believe that the dead were still with them. Hence, they had a fascination with seances and spirits, and of course, post-mortem photography, as you can see here. With the advent of the photograph, Victorians believed that they could capture the truth about death, and that there was still something alive in a deathly state. And this is just one post-mortem photograph from the Victorian era. There's so many like this. Family portraits, where families would actually position their dead loved ones, children, sisters, wives, as if they were alive, and oftentimes would be accompanied by family members with the advent of photography during this period. I'll take your question right after. Just hang on to it. We're almost there. Actually, we are there. I wanted to end with an inscription that Queen Victoria has above her tomb, where she's buried, and it says, "Farewell, best beloved. Here at last I shall rest with thee. With thee in Christ, I shall rise again. Thank you so much for your time. Okay, so thanks for staying, guys. Good to see you. I want to spend maybe about 15 minutes or so with Q&A, and then if there's extraneous questions or comments, I'll be down here in the pit. The pit. If you guys want to, that sounds so cozy. I'll be down here in the pit if you want to come and talk. So I'll be happy to take any questions. Yeah. And just say your name too.
My name is Sam Williams. And my first question relates to, could you expand more on how gods and angels are revenants? Because it seems like that's kind of incongruous coupled with the other things that you said were revenants.
Right.
And how I perceive them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wouldn't say that all gods are revenants. I mean, some gods we don't know, like the Christian God, for example, we don't know origin. We don't know, he didn't seem to die or come back.
Yeah.
But I think through like, there's so many gods. I'm thinking about the Greek tradition, the Roman tradition, where to be a god was kind of like just to be a human in a lot of ways. You know, there were so many gods that a lot of them would die or they'd be brought back by a particular god, and then they would become gods themselves. So that's what I mean when I talked about that status.
And angels?
Yeah, and angels. So angels have revenant status because after they die, when you come back as an angel, that's a way of coming back to life after death.
Okay.
Yeah, in an angelic form.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's why they're considered revenants. So a revenant is really just simply if there's life after death, that gives you a revenant status.
I was thinking of like the Catholic angels, which I don't think are people who have become angels. They're like a separate group that God supposedly created.
Okay.
And I'm not Catholic by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just remembering Dogma.
Yeah.
Kevin Smith movie.
Huh.
You know,
I think I might have seen that.
anyway, he did,
Is that from 2000 something?
yeah,
2001?
it's great Kevin
Okay,
Smith
okay, I think I did see that.
Much better than Mallrats.
Cool. Yeah, well, thank you. Let's take another question. Yeah, Jen.
Do you think that there's a connection between, I guess, sort of the, especially in some of the earlier things, you know, the female control over creation of life and, you know, sort of pregnancy and childbirth, and then the later sort of control over death? Could you speak some to that, if you think that's the case?
So your question, let me just nail it down. So your question is asking, do I think that there's a relationship between, in the early representations,
Yeah.
the relationship between women and childbirth and women and death?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, you have in some of the things that, you know, sort of women were associated with, you know, using the zombie sort of a form of femininity, and another form of that would, I think, be sort of bringing forth life, which was a really significant mystery.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the juxtaposition of life and death as both female forms of power is really interesting, and I was wondering if you could talk some to
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Yeah, so thanks for the clarification. So I wasn't really able to find any female zombies where the idea of pregnancy and childbirth was invoked. But now that you mention it, it does seem to be, you know, you would think that there might be something. But I can say that the female body, we talked about this for those of you that are in class with me, the female body itself has been a site of horror because of the secretive nature of their inner workings of childbirth, even of their genitalia. It's something that's hidden. Right? So it's esoteric, something that can't be understood. And that's why the female form itself kind of invites that horrific discourse. Does that answer your question, Dan?
Sort of. I mean, I guess it's not necessarily horrific, but it's like it's sort of like an interesting like life dichotomy, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. What's your name?
Johnny Thomas. I was listening to you when you were talking about the Victorian era, and they were describing, like sexuality, like after death, and how beauty was in that a drowning suicide. So,
Yeah.
how did that really come about? Because you said how like change was happening a lot, and they had to confront death. But how did sexuality come into that?
That's a really great question. So this idea that so your question is what's up with that the sexualizing of the female body post-mortem, right? What's up with that? That's a really great question. So I don't know if I can answer that, with a definite answer of why they were so fascinated, but I can tell you that they wanted to feel as if they understood what death was. And the best way, I think, for Victorians to gain a sense that they could understand that was really through the female body. Because Victorians made so much meaning through the female body anyway, right? That they were the bringers of life. They could have children, they could bring that. And that there was also a message that they carried through death that they wanted to read upon. Women were others in the society, right? So Victorian culture tended to look toward women to help them with their meaning making. Why was the post-mortem female body so beautiful? Oh. What did you say?
They couldn't talk.
They couldn't talk?
But she had she was incredibly a site that you could impose whatever you wanted on. She became
Like a
a screen that
canvas.
you could literally just, it was this bit of canvas that you could put anything on. She had
Yeah.
no willpower and you were dominant.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the Victorian ideal of womanhood too was predominantly that women were childlike by nature, right? That they were the softer sex, that there was something imposable about them, that they were a site that would not only help you make meaning, but also that meaning was always going to be something that would purify you or save you in a way to come back to the woman, that she had that ability. So I think the post-mortem woman kind of acted almost like an amulet in that way, right? But it was looked at just surely aesthetically pleasing. The cold skin, the marble nature of post-mortem, very stiff. We see it in tales like The Return of the Native is one of my favorite articulations of the corpse as beautiful. Thomas Hardy, he's my favorite author of all time. Has anyone read The Return of the Native? Add it to your book. Add it to your list of me. Yeah.
And Edgar Allan Poe said something about the dying young woman being the most beautiful poetic subject
Yeah.
that's possible. So
Yes,
that was-
absolutely. A lot of writers, they think about the deathly female body, the dead female body, as very attractive. I don't pretend to know why, but I gave my best guess. Yeah.
There's a book series by Garth Nix. The first book is called Samaria, and it kind of talks a little bit about gates. I don't know how to explain it. I haven't read it in a long time, but it talks about gates and kind of each gate goes to death. And I think Garth Nix is one of my dad's favorite writers, and so he kind of taught the books to me young. But I think that there's this point that you can't pass, that you can come back.
Huh.
And so I kind of was, I'm trying to put a question in there somewhere. But I guess I'm trying to ask, do you think that that kind of idea of, at the beginning of the book, I don't know if anybody here has read Samaria, but at the beginning of the first book, a woman dies giving childbirth, and is kind of, he talks a little bit about how, the author talks about how she goes on, and I guess I was wondering, I'm not wording this very well.
No worries. So when you're talking, if I could interject, you talked first about the gates and kind of descending through the gates, and then you kind of did ask a question there when you said, is there there seems to be a certain point where you can come back to the world of living as like a being rather than a revenant. Is that kind of what you were getting at with that question?
No, it's literally, there's a point where, I think it's 7 gates. I'm pretty sure it's 7 gates, if I can remember correctly. But there's a certain gate that if you pass that gate, you can't come back at all. Mm-hmm. And there's a certain gate that you can come back fully as a human or as a full person, not as a revenant.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm wondering if in your research if people ever talked about that as there's a kind of like a point of no return a little bit.
Absolutely. I mean, we see it with Ishtar. I mean, in the early mythology, that she kind of goes down through the gates, and as she goes through the gate, right, she sheds a piece of her clothing. And with a lot of Greek mythology, I'm thinking of, it's not coming to my mind, but that myth in which a female wants to see her husband who is in the world of the dead, and she had, what is the name of this myth? What is it? It's not Persephone.
Is it Orpheus?
It's Orpheus. Yeah.
Orpheus,
Yes.
he wants to see his.
He wants to see his
And then
his
he
lover.
gets the golden bough, and he's told that if he carries it into Hades, then he can see his lover, and that she can come back to the world and living with him, but only if during the entire time back up he never turns and looks at her.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
And
exactly
then
right.
At
Yeah.
the last instant, he happens to turn around and see her, and then
Yeah.
she's
Yeah.
gone forever.
Yeah.
And then he goes crazy, and then he gets like killed and eaten by some wild, crazy like nymphs.
Yeah, that's a good, so that story, we see it in the Aeneid, when Aeneid goes down into the underworld and he gets a tour. We see it in the Inferno, when Dante goes down, he has a guide, he goes through, and then he comes back. So absolute, that is really a hallmark of so many mythos really, is that idea of descending. You can descend and come back to a point, but there's always a point of no return, right? Yeah, good question. Well,
I had a couple questions. So with zombie, is it an equal opportunity like occupation? Like can anyone become a zombie, or do you have to have a certain, I mean, you're saying in some cultures like only females can become zombies, or not even become zombies themselves, maybe rise others to become zombies. So
yeah.
does it seem like there's something that happens that's a part of you, maybe genetically you can be a zombie and some of us can't?
So that's a great question. So is being a zombie an equal opportunity? I love that state. And I would say it depends entirely on the cultural moment. I'm thinking 21st century zombies, it's a free-for-all. Anybody can become a zombie, in my opinion. Check me if I'm wrong. But it seems like you die, you come back. But tracing it through history, it seems like it's very particular, only to particular kinds of people with particular kinds of power can get that status of being a revenant. Whereas in the 21st century, I would say it's more like everybody's actually a zombie anyway, so it doesn't really matter, you know what I mean? It doesn't really matter. In the 21st century, it seems like being a zombie is just part of the human experience. Like there's something human about being a zombie, and I think that's really being pushed more and more as we go on in this century, right? That there's something, they're kind of like us, right? There's more and more books coming out that make that association, but I think in the past it hasn't been that way. It hasn't been equal opportunity, I would say. Yeah.
And I think my second question was just zombies and vampires. Where is their split? Can you maybe be part zombie, part vampire? I mean, like, because when you were seeing, and I'm seeing like some of the visuals of it, it was reminding me of just exactly how women were coming in the night and fornicating with their lovers as vampires.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was like, is that where the masculine death came? That's where masculine power was in death. But then feminine power could be in zombies with the sexual. Feminine power could be in the vampires. I don't know, I thought.
No, it's a good question. And in my research too, it's hard for me to distinguish between what's vampiric and what's zombic, particularly in the 19th century, where I think it becomes really conflated. And I think that's something that happens with all of the revenants, In the Victorian era too, the mummy becomes very popular. There's a lot of crossover where the tropes, they're all revenants, and that's the thing.
Right.
Then, how true writers and artists are staying to that particular lore, it runs the gamut. Some really are just about the vampire, but there's a lot of conflation. Just looking at the Bride of Corinth, he's adapting it from a zombic story, but yet she's considered the first vampire. So I think you're really right to just note that there's, where's the line? And the line is blurry.
Right.
For sure. Let's take 2 more questions. Just tell me your name.
Chris,
Hey, Chris.
do you think it's the fear of the unknown that drives these
like life after death theories, or do you think it's more an attitude of boredom towards the human condition? What do you think?
I think both of those, absolutely, absolutely. The zombie is absolutely, any kind of horror, I think, is an articulation of our fears. But I think one point about horror and zombie in particular that captivates me is how these motifs can articulate hope. I actually feel like there's a lot of hope that's articulated through horror.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like an overlooked aspect of horror. With the zombie, for Victorians, I think that for them, to see a body that was a sheer other, that was kind of disabled by a society, I mean dead, able to kind of move forward and walk and change. Victorian zombies really could transgress gender boundaries. For example, Robert Audley's Secret is a great example of that, where he's able to kind of have these feminine characteristics, but move forward in this kind of deathly way to become heroic in a very masculine way. So I think, especially for Victorians, it does articulate fears, no doubt, but I think it also articulates hope for the future. Absolutely.
Because I've been suspecting that, like, you don't necessarily have complete control over this, because I know people who choose to believe that, like, dead relatives of theirs are still alive, even though they might not really believe it, that they choose to believe it,
Yeah.
it feels better to them, so.
Yeah, I mean, there's that aspect too.
It's kind of like a trap.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain degree when someone that we love passes, we always want to believe that they're with us somehow in the present moment. So that is hopeful as well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's take one more question. What's your name?
I'm Andrew.
Yeah.
I think kind of a sort of, I guess sort of tangential question about some of the other cultures that you didn't mention.
Yes.
It was, for example, like the ancient Egyptians
Yes.
and their vision of death.
Yeah.
They sort of viewed it as basically a continuation of like the real world. When you died, you just did the same thing that you did when you were alive. You were a farmer, you farmed, you hung the rope. But then they made mummies, and there's this big cult of death. And there's like, they made spell books, like the Book of the Dead, to help the soul cross over, basically.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting to me. It's a whole different perspective about death.
Yeah. Absolutely. I left the Egyptians out on purpose because there's so much there, but it is making an appearance in my book.
Osiris.
I think you're right. Osiris. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Let's take one more. What's your name?
Micah, quick one. The two images that you showed that depict Christ and the angels,
Wait.
was the image of Christ surrounded by a halo coming out of a cave resemblant, because death is considered a dark topic, was Christ coming out of the cave dressed in white, which is a brighter color, surrounded by a halo, the image of trying to put the concept of death behind you as if it's a dark thing, and more moving into the light, which that light might represent life and well-being, and maybe something along those lines, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the images of Christ definitely bring out that positive aspect of death. You know, like through death, you're able to reach a higher state, right? And that there's the promise there of being born again. There's the promise there of coming back through your faith. And I think absolutely. So the white, the halo, all of that is like really celebratory, right? We're emerging, we're coming back. The promise is being fulfilled, that through death comes life. And so yeah, I think absolutely it's there. Okay. Well, thank you guys. I will be down here.
The landmark speaker series appreciates the support of the local businesses, GPI Construction, and the Richards Insurance Group of Brattleboro.